We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, with my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon.
Thank you, Garland.
The people of Africa see the military operation in Ukraine through a unique perspective. Also, why is the Russian intellectual class hardening their support for Ukraine? Joining us to discuss these important issues, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's a historian, researcher, author of many books, not the least of which being his newest book. It's called The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. You can find it online wherever books are sold. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Responsible Statecraft, as usual, you have to take all of their articles with a grain of salt at the least, writes, African policymakers and civil society opinion makers, like their counterparts around the world, share no consensus on the war in Ukraine. Its impact is undeniable as the economic fallout for Africa has been profound, not least in the shortages of wheat and fertilizer from the region. Dr. Horne, your thoughts on the African perspective on the military operation in Ukraine?
Well, there's a growing hysteria in the North Atlantic bloc about the role of Africa in this conflict in Central and Eastern Europe. Interestingly enough, many of our friends on the left with tunnel vision, when they analyze this question, their view goes from Washington to Ukraine to Moscow with nary a peek at what's going on in the rest of the world. But the North Atlantic bloc cannot afford such tunnel vision. And given the reality that they were catapulted into global prominence, not least by the machinations of the unlimited African slave trade, and then continuing to use Africa as a reserve and as a source for exploitation of oil, of natural gas, etc., we should take their critique of Africa very seriously. In that regard, look at this morning's New York Times, where on the front page, there is an implicit critique of Senegalese leader Macky Sall, also titular chair of the African Union, the continental-based organization that is based in Ethiopia, for daring to visit Sochi, Russia. And on the front page of the New York Times, they have Macky Sall referring to, quote, my dear Vladimir, unquote, and referring to the president of Russia. And that was basically designed as a slap at Macky Sall and at the African Union and at those African nations, which, as the article points out, are trying to avoid being dragged into the sanctions crusade. Interestingly enough, the Congressional Black Caucus, as we've mentioned previously on this program, have not bathed themselves in glory with regard to this conflict. Instead of rising to the defense of their African brothers and sisters, which the rhetoric would lead us to believe would be their position, instead, Congressman Gregory Meeks of the CBC and of Southeast Queens, New York, has carried legislation that would punish African nations for daring to not join the sanctions train against Moscow. I think that this is a moment for sober reflection. If we had a more democratic country, the entire foreign policy establishment would be summarily fired, if not worse, because that establishment basically cut a deal with China 50 years ago against the interests of Moscow and then poured U.S. direct foreign investment into China, creating a juggernaut, denuding the industrial base of the United States, leading to the rise of this right-wing populism. And obviously, they did not think through the consequences of the breakup of the Soviet Union, on which they spent trillions, and in which they imprisoned and persecuted those not willing to go along, because, okay, you don't want a socialist Soviet Union. You want to break up the Soviet Union into its constituent elements. You succeed in that. And emerging from the ashes is Russia. Soviet Union has 250 million population. Russia has 160 million population, but still it is able to maintain the nuclear arsenal. It's able to maintain most of the mineral resources. And so you basically create, in some senses, a capitalist class in Russia that's then going to compete with you for resources in Africa and globally. And then instead of inviting Russia into your capitalist club, speaking of the group of seven, it was once the group of eight, you then expelled them because I guess you can't stand the competition. And now you're at war with them. As I said, if there were justice, if there was more democracy, we would force all of these foreign policy mandarins to walk the plank.
There's I think, a very telling paragraph or two paragraphs in this responsible statecraft piece. It reads, "For Africans, the war in Ukraine is a painful reminder that Western foreign policy priorities, in part as reflected by mainstream Western media outlets, are still shaped primarily by racial bias and geopolitical rivalries rather than the urgent global issues that face Africa and the world." And I would throw in there, just as an example, wheat and fertilizer. And then it goes on to say, "For Africans as well as others who have lived in Africa or worked on African issues, the disproportionate attention given to this war featuring white people compared to more deadly ongoing wars in Africa is a sad repeat of biases that were pervasive during the first Cold War." So I think that those are very real realities that unfortunately get summarily dismissed if discussed at all. There are practical applications here that are being ignored, but Joe Biden still wants to talk about sovereignty and democracy and respecting the will of people to dictate their leaders how they want to be governed. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to apply when the American interests are being challenged.
Well, unfortunately, tragically, and sadly, only the most deluded and naive of forces on the U.S. left believe the fantasy they're able to successfully launch a boycott, divestment, and sanctions crusade against Russia that will serve as a precedent and as impetus for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions crusade against Israel. Obviously, that's not going to happen. Obviously, there's a double standard with regard to international relations. Even the most naive should be forced to acknowledge that reality, which, of course, then brings us to how Haitians are treated when they try to enter the United States of America, where you see these full-page ads in major U.S. newspapers with corporations like Booking.com trumpeting the fact of how they're giving all of these benefits to Ukrainian refugees. And we're supposed to be naive and sufficiently deluded to believe that the Haitians are just waiting in line to be accorded the benefits that are accorded to the Ukrainians. That's lunacy. It's fantasy. It's not going to happen. And in fact, it's insulting. And in fact, it's a apologia for racism, because that's all that it is.
Let me ask you this also. You know, we're talking about Africa, but I believed for a while, when I started seeing the reactions, when I looked at the U.S. going to Asia, going to countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and places where Cambodia, where the U.S. has literally perpetrated genocides, going to South America and being shocked that the Latin Americans were supporting Russia over the U.S. Same with the Middle East after the years of colonialism from the U.S. and the Europeans. I believe to some extent that this conflict has opened that scab of colonialism, centuries of colonialism, and that a big part of this, even China, is about having been colonialized by the U.S. and even prior to that by various European empires, and that this is maybe they see this as their chance to push back on all of those centuries of colonialism. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, certainly it's a chance to push back against hypocrisy. And that's all that we're talking about. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia, for example. There's back and forth on whether Mr. Biden will receive the ignominious privilege of going to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and being forced to bend the knee and kiss the ring of the de facto leader, Mohammed bin Salman, in an effort to get Saudis to pump more gasoline or pump more oil so that the price of gasoline at the pump will head downward from the $10, $11 per gallon to which it is heading. But what's happening is that the Saudis are making Mr. Biden twist slowly in the wind. They once did not receive his phone calls. That's as of a month or two ago. And now they're jerking his chain by once more saying that we'll meet with you and then backing off. There's grumbling in the State Department that there is a de facto alliance in the organization known as OPEC Plus, speaking of the Saudi-led OPEC Plus Russia, that is conspiring jointly against Washington. At least that's what the State Department thinks. And indeed, if you go back to the Group of 20 meeting that took place in Argentina a couple of years ago, go back and look at the pictures between Mohammed bin Salman and President Putin. They seemed quite chummy at the time. And so despite the fact that the Saudis are dependent upon the United States for arms to fight their inglorious war in Yemen, despite the fact that the Saudis are upset with the United States for seeking, at least appearing to seek, a nuclear arms accord with Iran, it appears that the Saudis are playing hard to get. In fact, if you look at the $2 billion they've given to Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, to play with, you would not be far wrong to suspect that the Saudis are basically making an investment in a Trump victory in November 2024 and are just stalling Biden until he's ousted from office. This is the contradiction in which the Biden administration has led this country.
There's another interesting article in Responsible Statecraft, something I've been hearing a lot about, and that is about how the intellectuals, as they put them, are hardening their support for the war in Ukraine. And that is, there was a group of an element that was very pro-West, a lot of academics, but that were pro-Western in Russia, and people expected them to side with the rest. And due to the West, due to a number of things, even that group now is siding with Putin, and it seems like he's getting up around 90%. I'm seeing numbers of support in Russia for the Ukrainian operation. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to cite the words of the late Osama bin Laden, who during the height of his seeming ascension suggested that folks in the Arab world were seeing his movement as the strong horse and seeing U.S. imperialism as the weak horse. I think that those intellectuals in Russia that you're pointing to, they're seeing their country as the strong horse. They're seeing the inflation-racked North Atlantic bloc as the weak horse. They're looking at the fact that in the last few months, China-Russia trade conducted in the currencies of both nations has increased by 1,000%. They're looking at the possible advent of a digital Chinese currency, which will allow China to lap up money from all over the world, including in Washington, D.C., ironically enough. And they're saying, why should the weak horse be backed when we're already riding the strong horse? This is something for everyone in Washington, D.C., not least in Foggy Bottom, to contemplate.
Well, quickly, they also seem to listen to the American rhetoric and feel that America is threatening the very existence of their country.
Well, you need to look at the headlines about this major weaponry being shipped to Ukraine, which will threaten these cities in Western Russia at least. They have good reason to fret.
We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas, and a researcher, historian, and author of his latest book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. You're listening to the